Hi, everybody. So here we are, chapter 2, week 2, where we're going to talk about childhood and adolescence. So childhood is seen by many theorists as the period of development that actually lays a foundation for who we will be as adults. Some older lifespan theorists believe that our development is created in a set of stages, which means that we move through these identified stages. But the idea is once we reach the last stage, that's it. We're done developing. Other lifespan theorists believe that we move through our development in a more continuous way, which means that we are constantly developing and changing throughout our life. The reality is that for each of us, we move through our development during childhood and adolescence, and it's a unique experience with each period of age or time, with each experience, and with each new change. And in the end, we become the sum total of all our experiences. And in a more Western perspective, we view our childhood and adolescence as a time to develop our autonomy, our psychological independence, or as the authors refer to it, our psychological emancipation. And one way that we can start to see how our experiences growing up have influenced us is through the creation of what's called a family genogram. And so a genogram is a diagram that consists of generations of one's family. And in the diagram, we use specific notations to identify specific types of relationships within our family, diseases, disorders, pivotal points in life, such as marriage, death, divorce, birth of a child, and so on. And so for this week, part of this week's reflection discussion is to create your own family genogram and then interpret or perceive the influence your family has had on you or on themselves throughout the generations. And this is a great tool to use to help to gain insight into yourself and the influences that your family may have on you. I used to use family genograms in therapy a lot because it really does help to put pen to paper and see how our family of origin has influenced us, okay? Now, in this lecture, we're going to talk about some developmental theories that try to explain how we develop over our life, right? And the textbook talks about a number of theories about lifespan development. And in this video, I'm going to discuss Erik Erikson's psychosocial model of development, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby's attachment theory, and one theorist that is not discussed in the textbook, and their name is Murray Bowen, and their theory is called Bowenian theory. So first, let's start with Erikson's psychosocial model. So the overall belief from Erikson is that at each stage, there are these expected desires or experiences that we have. Okay, and they have multiple stages throughout our life. With each of these expected desires or experiences, we will be influenced by our social and cultural environment. And this influence will eventually lead us onto one of the two conflicting sides that Erikson talks about. Okay, we have a negative side and a positive side. And each stage has a conflict that is occurring, okay? And so the idea here is that by the end of the period of life, all right, that we have, so we have 0 to 1, 2 to 4, 5 to 7, so on and so on. So by the end of that period of life, we will have integrated whichever side we landed on into our personality, and then we move on to the next phase of life. And this is how our personality is built, according to Erikson. Something to note is that we can actually go back and change these parts of ourselves, not go back, but we can change certain aspects of our personality, all right? When we do things like take a course, read a book, go to therapy, things like that, that's a form of intervention. And those interventions can actually help us flip from like a negative side to a positive side based on Erikson's model, okay? So first, let's start with Erikson's first stage. So the first stage, which is basically the first 12 months of life, okay? So the first stage is trust versus mistrust. So that's the conflict that is occurring. Trust, mistrust. And so what's happening during this stage is we're infants. We completely 100% rely on our caregiver. Okay, and so we're looking to have our needs met. Our needs for food, warmth, love, affection, being changed, being put to sleep, all that stuff, okay? And if our needs are met during this time, then we will end up on the trust side, where we develop a basic trust of humans. But if these needs aren't met, according to Erikson, then we end up on the mistrust side. And now we have more of a suspicion, okay, about people, humans. We're a little more skeptical about people. We don't necessarily put a lot of trust into other people, okay? Then we take that and we move to the next stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt. It's during this time that toddlers start to learn to exercise their own will. They start to begin to do things for themselves, or depending upon their environment and how their caregiver interacts with them, they may start to doubt their abilities. If they are encouraged to actually do things on their own, then they gain what's called a sense of autonomy, freedom, an understanding that they can make their own choices for themselves. But if they're not allowed to do these things on their own, if they're not allowed to exercise their own free will, then they start to feel shame and they start to feel doubt about themselves. And then they take, okay, we take whichever side we land on. We move to the next stage, stage 3, initiative versus guilt. So this is during like preschool. And this is when preschoolers learn to initiate certain tasks and carry out those tasks and finish them. So if they are given tasks to carry out, or they are, let's say in their preschool class, and the teacher says, who'd like to hand out the paper? And they go, I will, right? Or at home, they're told, all right, I need you to work on your homework. And they go, okay. And they initiate the task and they go and they work on their homework. Or they just immediately say, I want to work on my workbook, or I want to work on my homework. And then they go and they do it. That creates that feeling of initiative. But let's say that they're scolded or criticized or put down for the things that they're doing. Then they start to feel guilty, and they feel guilty about their efforts to actually work at independence, work at that psychological emancipation. So then we move from there to stage 4, industry versus inferiority. This is when we start to enter grade school. And now we are actually working to earn grades. Right? We're being praised for our grades. We're being rewarded for our good work. So we have to perform now, right? And that's where industry comes from. When the individual or the child starts to engage in this performing and getting good grades and being given good feedback from their teachers, from their parents, right? They start to develop a sense of industry. Okay. And this is when they start to learn the pleasure of actually applying themselves to the tasks they're doing. But if that child is being criticized or scolded or not getting good feedback and just comparing themselves to their counterparts who may be doing better in the class or better in grade, like with their grades, and getting, more feedback and so on, they may actually start to develop a sense of inferiority. Or the individual may start to think like, maybe I'm not as good as these people. Maybe I'm not as good at these things. And that inferiority can start to seep in. And then the people will stop doing things. Let's say like the child will be like, well, I'm not good at that, so I'm not going to do that. I'm not good at that, so I'm not going to do that. Because they will only do the things that they feel confident in actually doing. And this can cause a problem. Okay, the individual can develop a sense of inferiority where they feel less than. Then we move to stage 5. And stage 5 is basically adolescence. This is identity versus confusion. So the idea here is that when we're working through our teenage years, we're actually working to refine a sense of self by testing our roles, by figuring out our identity and kind of coming to terms with the question, who am I? And then as we do that, we start to integrate all of these roles. We start to integrate all these beliefs and values and morals, and we integrate that into one single identity. And if we can do that successfully, then we end up on the identity side. But unfortunately, if we cannot do that successfully, or we don't find that place where we fit in, or we don't really land on a very solid sense of identity, then we can end up on confusion, where the individual is confused about who they are as a person. And so then they're having a hard time guiding themselves through life because they don't really understand that question, who am I? Then we move into stage 6, which is intimacy versus isolation. Now we're moving into adulthood at this point, which is not part of this chapter, but I'm still going to cover it, okay? Because I want to go through all 8 stages of Erik Erikson's psychosocial development. So in stage 6, intimacy versus isolation. So this is that period of time when we're a young adult and we're struggling to try to form these close relationships. We're trying to gain an understanding and capacity of this intimate love and romantic love towards somebody else, okay? And this could be friendship as well. Like we could have an intimate love for our friends and our family, but we're starting to really understand these closer relationships and we're building closer relationships. And oftentimes individuals can be looking for that partner, that person that they're going to end up with, right? That they're going to commit themselves to. And if they do gain that competency and capacity, and they do actually potentially gain that romantic relationship, then they will end up on the side of intimacy. But unfortunately, if the individual doesn't really find that, or they don't gain the capacity for intimate love and sharing themselves with another person, or they did, and that the person that they shared themselves with maybe broke their trust, and so now they're having a hard time entering back into an intimate relationship with somebody. Well, then the individual may end up on isolation, where they withdraw themselves and they pull back. And they start to say things like, well, I'm just going to focus on my career. I'm going to focus on myself. Okay, because the individual has started to isolate themselves. Okay. Then we move into stage 7, which is going to be middle age. This is generativity versus stagnation. So generativity is when the individual discovers a sense of contributing to the world, giving back. Okay, often this is done maybe through like work or volunteering, and sometimes done through family as well. Okay, and it kind of creates this like purpose in their life a little bit, right? Like they feel this sense of, well, I am at a point where I have successfully achieved my goals, and I did not do this without help. So it is my time to pay back the work that was given to me when I was younger, right? Or the help that was given to me when I was younger. Now, stagnation. Stagnation is the negative side of this, right? And this is when an individual starts to feel like a lack of purpose, a lack of drive. They don't want to give anything back. You know, often they think that nothing was ever given to them. No one was there for them. So why should they help anybody else? That's a common thought of someone who is in the stage of stagnation. Then we move to stage 8, okay? And this is our like late adulthood, all right? And this is integrity versus despair. So in late adulthood, as humans, we are often reflecting back on our life because we're getting close to death. And when we're reflecting on our life, right, the individual may feel a sense of satisfaction with the choices they made and the goals they accomplished and where they are. And if they do have that sense of satisfaction, they have now landed in integrity. But if they do not have that sense of satisfaction and they reflect back on their life and they think, man, I regret a lot of my choices. I regret the fact that I abandoned that child when they were younger, right? And then they have this sense of failure, okay? Then they move into despair. So that's Erik Erikson's 8 stages. Now, they seem like they are non-continuous, like they're going to stop, and they eventually do, but they pretty much stop with like late adulthood. So we would view this as a more continuous stage. It's a development that we have throughout our life. And as I said, like later on in life, when in adulthood and even later into like middle adulthood, late adulthood, we can try to make changes. So if we end up on the negative side of something, such as, let's say, stage 5, identity versus confusion, the individual ends up on confusion and takes that to stage 6. Maybe they correct that during stage 6. It is possible, okay? Now, some of the drawbacks of Erikson's stages is it's very Western culture, right? It's very much focused on a more Western culture, and it doesn't always apply even within individuals who live in a Western culture. It doesn't apply across ethnicities very well, or well, it doesn't apply across all ethnicities. So it's not a generalizable theory, okay? But it does in some sense like make sense to a number, like when we apply it to like humans and human development, it does in many ways make sense, okay? All right, let's move into Ainsworth's attachment theory, which basically built off of John Bowlby's theories. Now, John Bowlby in like the 60s came up with this theory about development, child development, moving into adult development. And John Bowlby believed that a child had this innate instinct to attach itself to the primary caregiver, and that it was the behavior of the caregiver that would actually help to create or potentially damage the attachment bond. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I get that. But when Bowlby came up with this theory, it was not a common thought. Okay, when he came up with this theory, oftentimes it was actually the thought in the medical community, because John Bowlby was a doctor. In the medical community, the belief was actually that children are little adults and they need to be completely independent of their parent. So things like let them cry it out, don't hold them too much, don't allow them to become dependent upon you. They need to be these little independent adults. But Bowlby didn't believe that. He believed that love and affection and warmth was vital for growth and development, and that the attachment bond was very important, because the attachment bond is what would then create the relationships that that person had later in life and how they navigated those relationships. And so Bowlby talked about this theory, and he talked about how he believed that the child would actually exhibit certain behavior in very particular ways in order to establish, strengthen, and maintain that bond. And this could be as easy as like crying when they're hungry. To Bowlby, that meant that they were looking to have their needs fulfilled. And then based upon the behavior of the caregiver, right? If the caregiver is continuously giving attention and care, concern, love, and warmth, then the attachment bond is formed, okay? Now, if the caregiver is not giving those things, then there is an issue that is occurring. There is what he referred to as an insecure attachment occurring. Now, John Bowlby also believed that short-term separation from a primary caregiver would cause anxiety within the infant, because you are taking away the one source that fulfills this child's needs. And so Bowlby talked about how this anxiety, every time there was a short-term separation, every time there was some separation from the primary caregiver, the infant would experience this anxiety. And the anxiety would go through 3 stages, depending upon the length of separation or how often the separation occurred. Okay, so the first stage is protest. And in the first stage, the child starts to cry and scream, and they get angry when the attachment figure actually leaves. Okay. and like doesn't want them to leave and will hold on to them. And we're talking about like infants at this time. All right. And so they start to protest. Now, if the caregiver comes back and meets the protest and tries to comfort and care for the child, then this is going to strengthen the attachment bond. The problem is if the caregiver goes away for a longer period of time or a lot, then the child moves into despair. And so at this point, the protests of the child begin to fade and they start to become weaker. Okay. And the child starts to seem a little like less interested in their primary caregiver. Less interested when they come in, less interested when they leave. Now, if the separation continues, then the child may move into what's called detachment, right? Where the child detaches from the primary caregiver. Basically, this almost like light bulb goes off where it's like, all right, well, they're not here, so they're not going to take care of my needs, but I need to find someone who will. So then they start interacting with new people in their, potentially new people in their environment. Okay. And what we can see sometimes is like when a child has reached that stage of detachment, the primary caregiver leaves, they may not show much like response, or their response, they go immediately into protest, and then they move into anger and frustration, and they start to reject the primary caregiver at that point, right? So, and I'll talk more about this in a minute here. But if the caregiver leaves and then comes back and the child is upset, the child may like show signs of anger towards that caregiver, okay, by pushing them away, trying to get away from them, even potentially like trying to hit them. And so all of these things, what they end up leading to, according to Bowlby's theory, is that it creates an internal working model for the child. Okay, so the child is developing this internal working model of people and how to interact. Are they going to be able to trust or rely on this person to fulfill their needs? Are they not? How's that going to play out in their life? And so what ends up happening is they develop this internal working model, and that internal working model then leads to certain behaviors from that individual throughout their life, throughout their whole life. And this starts very young. We're talking like the first 2 years that this is created, okay? Now, Mary Ainsworth actually went on and she tested Bowlby's theory. And she was actually able to establish this idea of different attachment styles, which I'm sure you may have heard about before. And so, interestingly enough, Ainsworth's research has been tested, like retested again and again. And each time more evidence is being thrown in to support this idea of attachment styles. In fact, recent research has even added a new attachment style to Ainsworth's original 3. Let's go over those now. So first is the secure attachment. Secure attachment, when the infant attaches themselves to their primary caregiver because the caregiver's response to their needs is quick and sensitive and consistent. And then the child shows these feelings of feeling secure and willing to explore and happy and joyous. And the child believes and trusts that their needs will be met. That's a secure attachment. And then that attachment shows up later in life in other relationships, especially romantic relationships, where when someone is securely attached, they believe that their needs will be met by other people in their life as they start growing up, through friendships, through romantic relationships. They believe it, and so they feel securely attached. Then there's avoidant attachment. And avoidant attachment is when the caregiver's response is distant and disengaged, and they're just not really there for the child that much, okay? So the child may be crying, but the caregiver is just kind of whatever, let them cry, okay? And then what ends up happening with the child is they're just not very explorative. They become emotionally distant, okay? They don't really find themselves attaching to anything. And the belief is that subconsciously, they believe that their needs just won't be met. And because they believe their needs won't be met, what's the point of like trying to get them met by anybody because no one's going to meet these needs. And again, avoidant attachment shows up later in adulthood through friendships, through romantic relationships. An individual who has an avoidant attachment often doesn't really attach themselves to their romantic partner very well. Right? They don't really believe that their romantic partner will be there for them. So they don't ask for their needs to be met, and they stay distant and sometimes cold. Okay. Then there's ambivalent attachment. And so this comes from when the caregiver's responses are inconsistent. Sometimes they're sensitive, sometimes they're neglectful. And the child ends up coming to this understanding that they can't really rely on their needs being met by their caregiver. Okay. And so they just start to experience like high anxiety, a feeling of insecurity, frustration, anger, because they just don't know. Sometimes they will be met, sometimes they won't. And that's very frustrating to be in that uncertainty. And so ambivalent, we also refer to this as anxious attachment, again, shows up in adulthood as well. So when it's formed in childhood, it shows up in adulthood as well. This is where an individual just doesn't know if they can trust their partner to meet their needs. Maybe they ask for their needs and then they get really anxious when they ask for their needs and they're not being met. Now, the fourth one that is added on after some research is called disorganized attachment. Disorganized attachment comes from when a mother's response is extreme, erratic, like jumping all over the place. It can be frightening to the child. It can be very intrusive type attitude. It's this like 0 to 60, not being able to regulate one's mood, like just not knowing how to respond, or just constantly responding in a very aggressive way with the child. And so what happens is the child starts to experience like depression, mood depression, anger, becomes almost non-responsive to things, has flat affect where they show no emotion on their face. And what's happening, or at least what the belief is that the child is so like severely confused that they just don't know what to do to even try to get their needs met, because it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type situation for them. And so they just they shut down because they don't know what to do at that moment. And as I talked about, these attachment styles show up throughout your life, like they show up throughout our lives, unless there is a form of intervention that helps to create a more secure attachment. All right, so that's attachment theory. So lastly, let's talk about Murray Bowen and his family systems theory. So Bowen family systems theory is a family theory that Dr. Murray Bowen created in the 60s. And Dr. Bowen based his theory on the idea that human beings and families function as one emotional unit. Okay. And he believed that it's easier to understand them in this way, as one emotional unit. All right, you can understand their ties to each other, their relationships, whether it's multi-generational or within the one generation. Like there is something, there are these relationships occurring. Okay. And so he has 8 concepts that he talks about, and I'm going to go through each one of them and talk about how they look within like the family a little bit. Okay. So his first is called a triangle. All right. And so triangles, according to Bowen, are the basic molecule of human relationship systems. And often what we see is that within a family, you can have a 2-person dyad. So that's 2 people linked. And that 2-person dyad may start to become unstable, right? So anxiety is increasing, there's more conflict. And so it's really starting to become pressure. And so they're starting to break apart and they're experiencing a lot of anxiety. Bowen talks a lot about anxiety and how anxiety pushes us to do things or not do things, okay? And so you have either one or both of the members of the dyad. What will eventually happen is the tension and conflict and anxiety builds, they start to pull in a third person, or they try to pull in a third person in order to relieve some of this like pressure from the anxiety. And so now you have this triangle, right? So now you have this three-person system, okay? And so where the anxiety originated within the dyad, now they've pulled in this third person, and it's now that third person is experiencing the anxiety. We can see this with like parents and children a lot, right? And so, but the anxiety builds within these three, like even within the triangle, right? And so, in a three-person system, the anxiety has more places to go now between all three people. And the relationship where it originated experiences some relief. So that dyad starts to experience some relief because they have that third person. But when the three-person system can no longer contain the anxiety, it starts to involve more people. And they start to, that other person forms a dyad and then brings in a third person. And then you have these series of interlocking triangles that are all these relationships that are just people trying to relieve the anxiety within their own dyad. Okay. And Bowen just says this is kind of a natural function of a living system. And triangles can either have negative or positive outcomes depending on how their members manage their own anxiety and the way they interact and react to each other. So Bowen postulated that if one member of the triangle remains calm and in emotional contact with the other two, then the system, right, will automatically start to calm down. But on the other hand, with enough stress and reactivity, members end up locked into a triangular position, and then they start to develop all these like symptoms, okay? So if all three people just anxiety gets too high and they start, experiencing these heightened emotions with each other all the time, then symptoms start to develop. And for some individuals, this may be like physiological symptoms, or it may be psychological symptoms. So it may be within the body, or it may be within the brain. Now, the second concept is a very important concept in Bowenian theory, and it's called differentiation of self. All right, and this concept, differentiation of self, is depicted with a theoretical scale. Okay, and the scale is like you have low differentiation or you have high differentiation. And it's trying to describe how people cope with life's demands and pursue their goals on a continuum from most adaptive to least adaptive. And so variations in this adaptiveness depend on several connected factors, okay, including the amount of what's called a solid self. A solid self is the part of oneself that is not negotiable in relationships. This is who they are, and they will not be affected by anything else. Okay. So for example, a person with well thought out principles enhances their own solid self, and they will not be swayed by fads or opinions of others. They have developed a sense of solid self, right? A person with a less solid self will feel more pressure to think, feel, and act like the others. Okay. So if you think of a circle as this is our self, and if it's a solid circle, that is a solid sense of self. But if it's a bunch of dashes made up into a circle and there's a bunch of like broken areas, then that is a less solid self, and people and influences can get in there, and then it starts to change. This is kind of like that identity versus confusion from Erickson's model. Okay. And so a fusion can occur. When an individual has a less solid self, they can start to fuse with other people, often with just one other person. So this fusion between two people starts to generate more chronic anxiety as one becomes more sensitive to what the other one thinks, feels, and does. So then they start to care more about what is going on with the other person and less about what is going on with themselves. This is where codependency can come from. Okay, codependency is different from dependency. Codependency is this idea of feeling the need to take care of other people because that is their identity that they have created. And so they put other people ahead of themselves. They take care of the needs of other people while sacrificing their own needs. That creates a sense of codependency. Dependency is when the individual is unable to make their own life choices. They're unable to actually do things in their life without another person telling them. They depend upon other people. Codependency is when they are actually creating this dependent relationship, but it's the other person that starts to depend upon them. That's why it's called codependency. Now, the level of differentiation refers to the degree to which a person can think and act for themselves while in contact with emotionally charged issues. So they don't get caught up into the anxiety and the emotion. It also refers to the degree to which a person can discern between thoughts and feelings. This is a big thing for me personally, okay? Because thoughts are not feelings and feelings are not thoughts. They're connected, but they're not the same, right? One of my biggest pet peeves is when people say, well, I feel that blah, 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 right? And really what they're saying is, I think that blah, blah, blah. But instead they say, I feel that, right? But the thing is anytime, and it'd be great for you to practice this because it's best to understand these differences. But anytime you or anyone starts a sentence with I feel, a feeling word must follow. I feel sad. Okay. If a feeling word doesn't follow, then it is going to probably be a thought, not a feeling. Those are two different things. Thoughts are the way we think. Feelings are how we feel, right? When we feel sad, there's something going on within our body physiologically that can help us identify that we are feeling sad. And then we have thoughts about our sadness or thoughts that create sadness. Sadness is a feeling. Thoughts are what's in our head, okay? So at higher levels of differentiation, people maintain separate solid selves. Even under like considerable stress and anxiety, they don't give in. They manage their own reactivity and they choose thoughtful actions. So they filter and choose how they're going to react, if they are going to react, what they're going to say, and how they're going to say it. Whereas at lower levels of differentiation, people depend on others to function, and they develop significant symptoms under stress. So when they're put under stress, there's a lot of anxiety that comes out. They're experiencing a lot of symptoms because of it. And generally because they don't know how to handle these things on their own, because they don't have a solid sense of self. Okay, they act often destructively based on their anxious reactions to the environment versus thinking things through. Their intellectual reasoning actually fuses with their emotions. This is why I stress the idea of thoughts and feelings being separate, but still interacting with each other. But for individuals with a low level of differentiation, thinking and feeling or thinking and emotions are almost exactly the same. There is no differentiation between these two. And understand that even highly intelligent people can be poorly differentiated. Okay, they can have a poor solid sense of self. It is not about IQ in this moment. Okay, it is about having a differentiation of self, not allowing the anxiety of others to affect us. Okay, 3, nuclear family emotional systems. There are 4 basic relationship patterns where problems can develop in a family: marital conflict, dysfunction in one's spouse, impairment of one or more children, and then emotional distance. The nuclear family manages differentiation and anxiety through conflict, through distance, through what Bowen calls over and under functioning reciprocity. So how we actually interact with each other. So someone may be over functioning where they're taking care of everyone, or someone may be under functioning where they're just not contributing. And so at extremes, this can lead to dysfunction in a spouse, or it can lead to what's called child focus, where the individual just focuses on the child and they pour all their energy into that child. So people engaged in conflict will fight, argue, blame, and criticize each other. And partners who distance tend to be emotionally unavailable, and they avoid any potentially uncomfortable or tough, important topics. So they just don't really talk about them because they're maintaining distance, all of a way to either release or avoid anxiety. Reciprocity in relationships occurs when one person actually takes on responsibilities for the twosome. Okay? The two people slide into what is called a over adequate or under adequate role. So over adequate, okay, meaning that they're taking on way more responsibilities, or under adequate, where they're taking on very little responsibilities. And sometimes that may work, but often that actually creates a lot of stress and anxiety for the person who is in the over adequate role. And so this can become so extreme that one partner becomes incapacitated, okay, according to Bowen, with either like an illness or like a general lack of direction, not knowing what to do in life, like, or they become child focused. Okay. Where they're focusing all their energy on just that child. Which brings me to number 4, which is the family projection process. So you have a fixed triangle, which is evident in the family projection process, where parents in a nuclear family focus their anxiety on that child. So you have the parents who have the dyad, who bring the child into it, and now you have a triangle, and now they're fixed into it because nobody is trying to change anything. So that child who's getting all of this anxiety from parents starts to develop problems. And then it's at that point that parents will usually attempt to get the child to change, or they try to reach out to an expert and get the child to change because the child is exhibiting the problems. They're the problem according to parents. But the reality is if the parents just manage their own anxiety and started to resolve their own relationship issues, then the functioning of the child will automatically improve. I'll give you a story. I was working with a adolescence, okay, 14 years old. I was working with this 14-year-old. Their parents brought the 14-year-old to me to help with behavioral issues at home. So I started working with the 14-year-old, and I am partly Bowenian, okay? So I view family systems through a Bowen family systems perspective. So while working with this 14-year-old, I started to want to bring the parents in. So I brought the parents in and I did a little family therapy with the 3 of them, right? And I saw that they had formed this fixed triangle where the dyad, the parents, were having so much anxiety in their own relationship that they brought this third child in and started pouring, or they brought this third person in, the child, started pouring all their anxiety onto the child. And then that child was acting out and they were having behavioral issues. So while I was working with them, what I eventually did is I asked them to see them just as a couple. So I started helping them as a couple and giving them a place to actually talk and work on some of their issues. And I did that for a few weeks, actually. I think we worked together as a couple for a month, and I stopped seeing the daughter. And then at one point, the couple came in and they were like, "We don't want couples therapy. Why do you keep doing couples therapy?" And I asked them, I said, "How's your daughter doing at home?" And they were like, "Oh, she's doing amazing. She's doing wonderful. Like her grades are getting better. She's doing chores. She's listening better." I said, "How come you think that is?" I said, "Well, I don't know. Why?" And I said, "Because you are getting help You're getting help. It's relieving the anxiety that your child is feeling. So then they are behaving better because they see that you are getting help and that you're relieving anxiety from them. And they were like, well, we don't want couples therapy. We just want you to see the daughter. And I told them, I can't just see the daughter. You all are one emotional unit. I have to see either you, the two of you as a couple, or all three of you. But I can't just see the daughter because she's not the problem. So they ended up not wanting to continue. So I said, okay. And then a couple, maybe 2 or 3 months later, they called me back and said, well, our daughter is behaving poorly again. Can you help? And I said, I can if you guys come in. But I'm not just going to see the daughter because she's not the problem. And they refused to do it. And you're going to run into that. If you're going to become a therapist, like you're going to run into that. And it's okay. It's going to happen. All right. But using Bowenian theory, all right, in this family projection process and the fixed triangle, I can conceptualize and understand what's happening within that family. All right. Now, 5, multi-generational transmission process. So differentiation of self is transmitted through the multi-generational transmission process. And this concept describes patterns of emotional process through multiple generations in a family. And it offers a way of thinking about the family patterns that go beyond the dichotomy of just genes versus environment, right? It is a multi-generational experience. And one of the ways that family patterns are transmitted across generations is through relationship triangles. Now, when you're doing your family genogram, you can integrate Bowenian therapy into that. In fact, you'll find some of the notations for the family genogram come from Bowenian therapy or Bowenian theory. And so when you're looking at these multiple generations, start thinking about, well, what are the relationships between all of these people? Are there any potential triangles that have occurred, right? And what's being passed down generationally, right? Any disorders, diseases, and any ways of thinking, patterns of emotion, how are they being passed down generationally, right? Here's the question. How is the anxiety of the past generations being passed down to the future generations? All right, number 6, emotional cutoff. All right, so at this point, you might be thinking, oh my God, there's so much information. I'm going to post my lecture for this video, okay? So don't stress out too much. Emotional cutoff, number 6. This is an extreme distancing, all right? And it constitutes the concept of emotional cutoff, where the family members discontinue emotional contact with each other in order to reduce the anxiety that they're experiencing. They just say, that's it, I'm done. I don't want to deal with this anymore. I don't want to feel this anxiety, so I don't want to interact or talk to this person anymore. And this has significant implications for the functioning of future generations, because as the emotional family unit is severed in such a way that anxiety has fewer places to be absorbed in the extended family systems. Because by severing these things, you're severing triangles, and triangles are created in order to spread the anxiety of the family out a little bit. And so to reduce tensions in the family by creating emotional distance, that's the idea here, right? That's the emotional cutoff. Create this emotional distance, thereby the tension and anxiety drops. Now, Bowen's theory does point out that this may allow an issue to go dormant, almost like a Band-Aid, but it is not resolving the issue. It is not resolving the conflict. Bowen points out that differentiation of self is what's going to help in this situation, because the anxiety that people are trying to, family members are trying to put onto another person, someone with a solid sense of self, a high level of differentiation, is not affected by that. And so they are calm, and their calmness helps calm the other members of the family. That's Bowen's theory, right? All right, number 7, sibling position. So Bowen believed that based upon sibling position, it creates specific patterns of behavior. Okay, like oldest, youngest, middle child, they all tend towards certain functional roles in the families. And this is often influenced by the position that they are born, right? And also the sibling position of their parents and the sibling position of other relatives as well, right? Because it is a generational thing. And so things like the oldest child is often the more controlling child. The youngest child is often the more passive child. The middle child is often the overlooked child that plays a particular role of maybe a like scapegoat, right? The youngest child might be viewed as like the only hope of the family. So a lot of attention gets put on the youngest child. The youngest child might be the one that actually most often gets pulled into a triangle with the parents or with caregivers. It doesn't even have to be parents. It could be other, it could be like grandparents. It could be like a grandmother and then a mother, and then they're pulling in the child, like whatever it is. I'm sure there are triangles all over families, okay? The number 8 is the societal emotional process, okay? So this number 8 looks more at society and how society plays a role on our family. Each concept also applies to a non-family group, such as work and social organization. And it's meant to reflect how society operates on a behavioral level. Okay, so we see it at the family level, but we can actually see it in many non-family groups as well. So societal expectations affect the family unit, right? Whether that be with the expectations for the individuals based upon like gender identity, sexual orientation, race, class, or creed. All right, but these societal expectations are affecting the family unit, and then the family unit creates expectations for the individuals in the family. And then the individuals or the family start to create coping mechanisms in order to deal with what is being passed down, what these societal expectations, how they're being passed down through the generations. If you think about it, so your grandparents have a different societal expectation than you do, but that doesn't stop them from trying to put their expectations on you. Or they put the expectations on their children, and then their children put the expectations on their children. And they may differ from generation to generation, but you can almost track these societal expectations through the zeitgeist. Zeitgeist is just period of time. So through the zeitgeist, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010, 2020, you can track that there are changes occurring, but that from generations in the 1950s versus generations in the 1990s, they differ. And so that's what Bowen is talking about. All right, so those are the 8 concepts of Bowenian therapy. As you can tell, I'm a huge fan of Bowen's family systems theory. And I am because it shows how our family has influenced each other from generation to generation, and how important it is to make specific changes, some form of intervention, in order to create new and improved behaviors, new and improved ways of feeling, new and improved thought patterns for the future generations in our own families.